more for Van than anybody else. All right. Did you guys have a good week?
It's a great week.
Excellent. And the show at Arrowhead is all set up and everything?
The show up at Arrowhead is now up, and Brandon, his show is up, and we're going to be putting up a three-dimensional show this Friday as well now. They've allowed us to use some space up at the Arrowhead. So that's going to be awesome. We'll have a 2D and 3D artist represented there from the college. So that's great.
Very good.
That is really nice. Well, this week, we are kind of, I don't know how to segue at it all, so I'm not going to worry about it. We're just going into Cubism. And with Cubism, this is a movement that, okay, our house flooded and I redid the floors with hardwood, which is awesome. But what that means is when the dogs with their little toenails start prancing around, you can hear everywhere throughout the house. And it's awesome. It's truly awesome. So
I can't hear it.
You can't hear it?
I can't hear it.
Okay, good. All right. Forget I said anything then. Well, we talked a little bit about Impressionism, and Impressionism came in part, and Brian actually talks about this quite a bit. He knows a lot about this, and his insights are really good. But with the birth and spread of photography, and with the expanding interest in radioactivity and movement of electrons and how the eyeballs work and everything, there's just this new awareness of reality that really impacted how the Impressionist painters explored what they did. And putting it into context, they were still relating quite a bit with that shared visual imagery, visual language that so many people have. But as we move forward with the Expressionists, they were kind of exploring how far they could push things without going as far as Fauvism did and make anybody throw up. But with Cubism, there's a philosophy that came into it too, I think, that really shows through once everything is put into place. But I do remember that my grandpa, he's been passed away for about over 20 years now. So I'm absolutely certain he forgives most of the things I say about him. But he was one of those people that if you can't see it out the window, it's not art. And Cubism was something that he just did not like to understand. Which does kind of surprise me, because he was reading the large print Journal of the American Society of Nuclear Physics into his late 80s until he lost his eyesight completely. So and his perspective on things was around and appreciate it aesthetically. And if you know anybody that has Cubist works in their own family's collections of art, it seems like a lot of them have no idea how to talk about it either, which leads me to believe that it's an heirloom investment rather than a personal choice. But Cubism is one of those things that just gets me really excited, especially with in relation to contemporary comic book movies, when people are exploring alternate timelines and different possibilities in the metaverse, and all of that is actually a popular outgrowth of the work that really pioneering physicists did in the 80s, and even further back. Einstein even suggested that the possibility. And we'll get into that later if anybody's so bored that they want to talk about it. But into this area that we're moving in with a lot of the, well, before I get into that, I wanted to share this image really quick that I thought was absolutely hilarious. This is pretty much how my grandpa felt about Cubism. This comes directly as a result, a really harsh criticism by Louis Valset dismissing what he called the reduction of form to simple geometry and cubes. So John French Sloan, trying to react to that, did this drawing that I think the drawing in itself is very, very cool and does address a lot of Cubism, but he did it to be funny. And however, even it being funny, I think he does kind of address what Cubism is about. You guys can see that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. I think that is pretty hilarious. What we have is two guys that loved hanging around and yakking with each other about the nature of reality and everything that only art students think are important, in the only city in the world where people weren't throwing rocks at them and yelling at them to get a real job. And they were talking to each other in a really exciting time to be alive. You know, people are still getting really, or having access to really fascinating things that appear to be completely alien, both photographs and then the real thing, documentation. They're in an era where people can communicate with each other really, really well and kind of coordinate thoughts and discuss things. But they're also at the dawn of a new age of philosophy. And I don't think that this should be dismissed at all. Philosophy regarding what's real and how we interact with what we think is real. One of the terms for it is phenomenology. It's a philosophy about phenomena, you know, things that we interact with. And Descartes talked about something that has since been labeled the Cartesian dilemma, where he is still very much centered in this idea that the spiritual realm cannot touch on, affect, or be impacted by the physical realm. They are completely separate. And if that's true, how do we do anything while we're thinking, when we think about it? How can thoughts lead to actions? Or how can we have thoughts about actions? How can people be responsible for the things that they do when there's absolutely no intersection between physical reality and the mental state? The way that he kind of resolved that was by really dancing around this idea that God has created this universe that is so intensely, perfectly functioning through cause and effect, that our minds have developed to the point where we are conditioned to believe that everything that happens around us, which happened as a result of the initial Big Bang, and you know we're still feeling the effects of all that, but our minds are conditioned so that we believe we are responsible for the things that are happening to us, and that the things that our body does, even though it's a direct result of cause and effect from the moment of the Big Bang, with that we somehow are responsible for that. And of course, you can see the problem right away when lawyers get involved, or when anybody wants to go to church and would rather avoid the confession booth, because Descartes is saying essentially that nobody is responsible for their own behavior at any point. All we are responsible for is how we think about stuff that happens to a body that we have been led to believe is ours. I think that's horrible. I think that's incredibly sad. Well, into this field of thought, there are two philosophers that I think are really remarkable. And the reason why I think that this is appropriate is you've got artists around Paris who, just like artists today, have nothing better to do than to read and yak about the latest philosophical treatises and thoughts and yak about it in such a way using highfalutin words so that it sounds like to the people around them that they really are smart. And this is something that all of us artists do. Joey and I have taken classes like that. Van, you probably haven't yet because that's not what your degree is in, but it's a series of classes that are named other things so they can remain secret from the rest of the world. But essentially, we're trained to think so seriously about stuff that really doesn't matter to a lot of other people. And that may or may not be true. I can't reveal the truth of it because they would remove my artist card. However, there are two philosophers that have been thinking about what Descartes says over and over and over again. And with all that influx of communication and travel technology, transportation technologies through the 19th century into the very beginning of the 20th century, the birth of electricity, the widespread or the potential widespread use of the combustible combustion engine. This is a world where Husserl and the kindest and gentlest of the Nazi Nazis, Heidegger, both of these guys started talking about how our bodies and minds are pretty much the same creature. You know, our minds is just how our bodies think about and react with the world around us, and that absolutely everything impacts us in one way or another. Where even if something is taken out of a room, a year later, our habits with that thing in the room develop to the point where we still have bodily muscle memories of that thing being in the room. Have you ever found yourself walking through your house at night and you sidestep something that used to be there? And this is usually like the first 3 months after you move a couch into a different place. Or you're driving around in the neighborhood you grew up, and even though a third family has bought this or that home, since when you knew the little kid that lived in it when we were both 5 years old, you still think of it as so-and-so's house. And this is something that I think was first articulated by Ibn Khaldun in the 12th century, but for the Western world, Heidegger and Husserl are the two guys that are really talking about this quite a bit, where it is a fundamental change in how humans understand, articulate, and talk about the reality that we share. We know, for the 17 people alive that actually care. But Braque and Picasso, because they are in that realm of highfalutin, important speaking artists, these are things I think that they really thought about. What is reality? What is the nature of reality? What are the ghosts that surround us? How do we impact? How can we express our real engagement with somebody else? If you do a portrait, instead of just doing a portrait of what everybody in the world will see, that shared visual language that we're talking about that was active in the artist's roles up until about Impressionism, what if you engage the person you were making a portrait of and you knew them for more than a moment? You walked around them, you thought about them, you saw how they interacted with other people, and then tried to engage all of that in a single painting. You're not just making a flash moment of time. And I think this is also a reaction to the assumptive documentation of photography. Where photography, it's assumed that it is a documentation of a singular moment. I think these guys are also reacting to that too, because they're not making a portrait or an image of one facet and one moment. They are rather sharing with viewers, walking around the person, talking to the person, seeing how they deal with stuff, pick things up. Or if it's a still life, walking around the table, picking up a grape here and there, eating it, putting something back, drinking something, and sharing with you all those moments of time. And, I don't think this is something that can be easily dismissed. Our brains are so fantastic at any given moment, at any flash of insight, our brains are cataloging over 4 million bits of information. But our reticular activating system, which is this little thing that's about the size of a thumb, our thumbs, right at the base of our brains in between the two hemispheres, that instantly takes all those 4 million bits of information, catalogs what is most important to us according to how we have established our own thinking and our own personal priorities. And then consciously we become aware through the filtering of the reticular activating system, only about 40 of those 4 million bits of information. So our brains are fantastic. It's absurd when you think about it. And then the realization, like when we talked about last week, regarding instead of the diode model of the brain switches that has been popular for so long, people realize now that brains have these areas, these rooms where they process clouds of information, and our brains are essentially quantum computers. And it's just absolutely fantastic how much we can think. But I wanted to share this with you, because if we circle back, I talked a little bit about transportation technology. This is something that Picasso and Braque came in contact with at the turn of the century that was so foreign and alien to anything that they had seen in Europe. You have to go back about 2,200 years to find anything like this in Europe. And a lot of the stuff was not even discovered until going into the 50s. You know, so this is a way of looking at the universe that these guys have never encountered. Now, saying that these are African masks is like saying a mask is from the Western Hemisphere. I mean, both North and South America, including Alaska and every island you've ever heard of, can fit within the boundaries of the continent of Africa. More than 14,000, not just languages, but forms of communication were invented in the continent, and the human genome has a broader range of expression than all the rest of the world put together in the continent of Africa. But can you imagine how startling looking at these masks might have been for people that were raised in Europe? And it's because of the technology that comes from just the technology that developed to help people move goods easily from one place to another. And I think as we get closer and closer to the present day, this happens more and more often. The exchange of information, the exchange of goods becomes faster and faster and faster until it's almost ridiculous how quickly we can exchange things. But this impact that it had on these guys, I think, was profound and tremendous. In fact, a couple of years ago, there was a show in South Africa, and I can't remember which museum, but the curators put together traditional African masks from throughout the continent with specific Picasso paintings. And you can see in many places that he is very aware of this geometry that he was first introduced to in about 1902. I mean, it's absolutely stunning. And in the module, in the second part, I have a couple of videos that I want to share with you guys. One of them is just applying the tools of artistic critique to a Nok culture head. And the Nok, I believe, were a group of people that lived in present day Eastern Nigeria, right around there. And if you get an opportunity to, the greatest world conqueror that has ever lived is a guy named, he was the grandson of Mansa Musa. His name was Sundiata. He lived about 700 years ago. But he conquered and liberated a swath of land along the South Sahara and further south from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to Ethiopia. And in his wake, he forced education and literacy and the observation of freedom of religion. Absolutely amazing guy. But from him, that's where we get the Jene cultures, the a lot of the Ife culture survives, and these are groups of people that developed a lot of art that looks very similar to these masks that we just saw. You know, and so this is stuff that nobody even knew about until the colonizers from Europe were starting to come back home after their jobs with the government and governorships, bringing some of this stuff with them, and Rock and Picasso came in contact with these African masks for the first time. And I can imagine how much it shocks the world. I did want to share a really quick rundown of phenomenology so that it's not so baffling.
Okay, real quick. Van, do you have your mask that you made sitting right there?
Oh, Van, do you have a mask that you made?
Which one did I make again? I forgot, Joey.
You made a Ilfe. I don't know how to say the word. Or yeah, no, I think it was.
Oh, I did. It was an Ife mask from African culture.
Beautiful.
I moved that back into other clay, unfortunately. That was an awesome mask, though.
It
Andrew,
was.
in the summer, Joey and I took the class for ceramic and sculpture art history as well, and we did some Ife masks and sculptures in that class, which was really fun. So that's cool, Joey. I forgot about that.
Well, it's interesting to tie that in because the reason they know about those cultures is because they found the masks.
Yeah.
So
Right.
I had no idea that related into Cubism. That's kind of blowing my mind right now. That's like,
yeah. And Andrew, that you showed us that looking at those masks that you had up on the screen, it totally resembles Cubism. I'd never put those two things together. That's really interesting. That's pretty mind blowing.
yeah, it's cool.
Well, and I think the only way that could have happened is you have the Industrial Revolution empowering Europe and other world powers in those areas to really push forward their colonizing programs. And so there's a lot of these African nations that were overrun by Belgium and France and the UK. And while these people are living there, in spite of their best efforts, a lot of them are starting to respect the people around them. And they bring that stuff back to England fairly quickly. And within a short amount of time that is only possible with the technology that came as a result of the Industrial Revolution. And then you get in an area where newspapers are incredibly cheap. Everybody's talking to each other incredibly rapidly. And then they're starting to also question people question their relationship to the universe in general and the nature of reality. And I think all that stuff comes to a head in about 1907, 1910, right around there. And it's astounding to me because once you see it, you can't unsee it anymore. So I'm glad you guys see that. Well, I'm going to share this video really fast, if that's all right with you guys. And let's see. Okay, here we go.
Welcome to an explainer on phenomenology. At its most basic, phenomenology is the study of lived experience. As its name suggests, phenomenology is concerned with the study of phenomena that arise from the experience of being in the world. The development of modern phenomenology, established by Edmund Husserl in the early 20th century, was a break from the Cartesian system that pitched stark distinctions between the outer, real reality and the individual experience of reality. Following the Cartesian principle, outer reality is a separate and distinct entity that can only be understood in rational terms through cognitive processes of deduction. Sense perception was thought to distort this process, and certainly emotions were considered a lower form of experience emanating from the recesses of the body. In contrast, phenomenology seeks to understand the outside world as it is interpreted by and through human consciousness. Ontologically speaking, that means speaking in terms of how philosophers understand the nature of being and existence, Husserl purported that reality could be grasped by and through structures of consciousness by applying what he called intentionality to the object of study, or intentionally directing one's focus to describe realities. For Husserl, to achieve deeper understanding of an object of study, a researcher could quarantine their personal judgments, a process called bracketing, so that preconceived notions do not interfere with the phenomenological inquiry. It is at this point that Martin Heidegger's approach breaks with Husserl's process. In fact, Heidegger was very critical of Husserl's phenomenology, where Husserl sought to capture objects of study as graspable entities that could be objectively studied. Heidegger employed the notion of Dasein, the situated meaning of a human in the world. For Heidegger, consciousness is a product or construction of the historical context from which it arises, and in turn, one can never approach an object of study in a presuppositionless form. That is, objects of study cannot be neatly separated from their contexts, nor should they be. Reality and consciousness are co-creations, and because of this, human understanding always arises from the relationship between the two acting upon each other. Thank you for watching.
I'm going to try to talk about that a little bit. What they're talking about is we cannot come into any situation without any bias. Every situation has bias. And reality is not something that happens outside of our body that we have no control of. Reality very much is impacted by how we relate to it. Our consciousness, how we think of ourselves, derives from all our experiences and who we were at the beginning. But sometimes we can, just like as we meet more and new people, more and different people, we can be aware of how we might have biases and try to set them aside and embrace the new experience. And then the other thing that I think is really interesting about this is that how we interact with other people and our experiences with that other thing or those other people are just as important to the reality of that individual or other thing separate from us. This validates our relationship with everything around us. And you putting that next to the idea of a Cubist portrait, walking around the person, interacting with them, and trying to record all of that onto one canvas, it really responds to the idea that a big part of reality is our reaction to it and our embracing and relationship with it. Does that kind of make sense? Or is it still really okay? Because one of my 17,000 minors was classical philosophy, and it is really difficult sometimes to realize that normal people don't use a lot of these words.
There's
we have very few social skills.
There's a lot of meat there. My head is kind of spinning. That's a lot. That's a lot of stuff. But yeah,
I love.
I'm sorry. It's empowering to me to realize, or to put voice to the idea that reality is not just something that happens to us or in spite of us, but it is actually we are empowered. We have the strength to change reality just by the fact that we are aware of it. When Ibn Khaldun talked about that, because he talked about all of us live in a river of ghosts, where we are constantly washed up by the presence of the memories of everybody around us, everybody that we interact with, even their memories of other people impact how everybody interacts with each other. So none of us can truly be an entire island. None of us are ever entirely alone. We all live in this sea of shared awareness and reality that all of us have an equal responsibility for maintaining. and which I think is really exciting. And then when you put that into the awareness of this Cubist idea, as we look at some of these paintings, I think we can really see how they're engaging actively with the material that they're portraying. You know, it's not just a passive depiction of something. One of my favorite ideas about phenomenology comes from Heidegger. And one of the things he said is language is by itself problematic. Because every single time we choose to use one word, we have cut ourselves off from using every other word. So in the process of trying to be precise, we are actually denying ourselves more freedom of expression. And I thought, whether or not we can accept that as true, it is an interesting way of thinking about things. When the moment you start trying to express or share or communicate something, in that very process, you're cutting off all the other things that could be said. That's not a bad thing. I mean, when you are paring down your artist statement, so it's only 250 words long instead of three volumes in an encyclopedic set, I don't think anybody in the world is hurt by the fact that you're cutting off those extra words. Even though it may hurt you, nobody else is injured.
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes that I like to use is from Mark Twain. He says, I'm really sorry this letter is so long, I didn't have time to make it shorter.
Well, there's also a quote that I've heard is often attributed to Mark Twain, which is, it's better to keep your mouth shut and remove all, and be thought a fool than to open it and remove all doubt. I shared that with my friends when I was in Iran, and they thought that was totally something that Rumi would say. They thought that was awesome. But this is one of the reasons why I get so excited about Cubism, because it is no longer just a product that artists are producing for other people to consume. This is an active engagement with the audience, with the information, and with the subject that the artist is portraying, because they want you to be involved with their process of thinking. And I think that's beautiful. One of the saddest things I've ever heard is one of the largest private collections of original Picasso Cubist imagery is in a vault in Salt Lake, and it's hermetically sealed. Nobody ever gets to go in and see it. With one of the excuses being that the lights could damage the material and lessen their value. And I think that's sad, because Picasso made those things specifically so that you could engage with them and be a part of the world that he's constructing. I wanted to share an idea as well that I thought was really interesting. I'm sorry about that extra sound. Have you guys ever seen like pattern drawings? There was a card game that was really fun when I was growing up called Eureka. And Eureka, it just shared a lot of this kind of silly stuff that you see in the patent office, which I think about, I want to say about 1858, 1859, Abraham Lincoln made fun of this every opportunity he possibly could. But for a short time, the US Patent Office was shut down because everything that possibly could be invented already had been. And he thought that was the silliest thing ever. But we have these drawings. I'm gonna try to share this with you just so you get a sense for these different kinds of layout drawings. And I'm not going to turn on the sound or anything, but these kinds of drawings, I think most of us are familiar with, where it's like the layout diagrams. And this goes back way back in, way back in time. Can you see this? It's a floor plan for a temple. It's a floor plan of a Mesopotamian temple where they just kind of drew out where the walls would have their bases. And there's a lot of other drawings as well in this short video. This is an architect who's was buried with the plans of one of the structures he designed. But these kinds of drawings were things that people started being aware of that they could access, and all sorts of new businesses were forming when they were also constructing blueprints and separate designs and all this kind of stuff. This the early 1900s was an era of dramatic technological change, which meant that a lot of people were very aware of the need. If you're constructing and sharing information, you're also showing several different views of the same structure. There's something else that Brian points out when he talks about Cubism, where to drive home the idea that these people actually are sharing multiple views of the same object on a two-dimensional plane. Again, that's really hard to do, trying to compress multiple dimensions into one area. And I wanted to share something else that is kind of fun. We're probably not going to watch it at all, but just one of the tools that Cubism introduced that was also used famously by Hannah Hulk and the Dadaists, a little bit after this time period, was collage. And collage is a really old, as soon as people had the ability to start cutting flexible material and putting it together, they started to do that. I think some of the earliest examples of collage is actually with early leather armor that dates back to about the Bronze Age, when people would make sheets, cut out bits, and then of like leather and other things, and layer them on top of stuff, which is not something we even think that that's collage. But then with the advancement of, or with the invention of really cheap paper, then we can start seeing that it's being used more and more. Tejip is a Turkish word that means shiny or sparkly. And tejip is when people will do illumination by applying gold powder or gold leaf. That's an example of collage. You see some hints of this in Carolingian era bookmaking, but also between about 10th century on and forward, the Turks and Iranians were doing this kind of stuff quite a bit. And then, and as it moves towards Europe, it becomes more and more familiar. So let's see, let me see if I can find, okay. This is a medical treatise, and it was actually constructed as a collage so that people could peel up different things and see what was underneath within the body. And there, as we get closer and closer to the present time, we see a lot of this kind of material developing, particularly with in Victorian England, when color and paper printing were becoming less and less expensive. This is when you start seeing emergence of things like paper dolls, and paper dolls became a fantasy land for collage. And then, so it wasn't as groundbreaking and shocking for Picasso and Braque to use collage in their work, other than the fact that people hadn't done it with serious art before. It had always been relegated to illumination or supplemental to the text or whatever the idea was, or as children's toys. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. So that's another part of the background that leads into Cubism, because many Cubists embraced the idea of using collage in the work that they did. Now I want to, a lot of these ideas about phenomenology and stuff like that, and the intersectionality of technologies and understanding of the universe, these are all observations that I've had over time that seem to really explain a lot of what's going on in Cubism. But I wanted to share with you, I think that one of these is like 3 minutes, one of these is 6 minutes. I don't remember which is which, so let's hope I pick the right one that's shorter. But this is describes from another person's point of view what went into the making of Cubism. And I really like this. This is Art 101 or Art History 101, and the guy has just the right amount of the right mix of description and sarcasm. I think it's really wonderful.
So let's talk about Cubism, one of the most difficult to define art movements, but we're going to try anyway. Now, Cubism was one of the most influential visual art styles of the early 20th century. It's going to be created by Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque in Paris between about 1907 and 1914. Now, the French art critic Louis Vauxhall, who has turned up in the past, will coin the term Cubism after seeing the landscapes Braque had painted in 1908 in emulation of Cézanne. Vauxhall will call the geometric forms in highly abstracted works cubes. This is, of course, a misunderstanding, because what Cubism does is it strips all of the elements off of something and rearranges them so we can better identify. And one of the best examples would be something like, well, for example, your iPhone. After all, your iPhone has elements on it on both sides that are important to identifying the form, the screen on the front, maybe the home button, depending what version you have, the Apple logo and camera on the back. But of course, I can't show both sides at once, can I? Not if I want to depict it only once. So what the cubists will do is they take those individual elements, they study them individually, and then move them. So maybe the Apple logo and the camera move to the front along with the screen. And we see this in these images. Now, these are self-portraits by Picasso throughout his life. And what you see is on the left, a fairly straightforward self-portrait, something we would recognize. It's all based on proportions and relationships. The relationship between the eyes and between the eyes and the nose and the nose and the mouth and all of that. If you've studied art, you're familiar with breaking down the form into these various lines so you know where things sit. But by the time he gets to his cubist form in the middle, you'll notice, for example, that the eyes are not equal. That's because Picasso is studying one eye and then the other, completely independent of one another. And their placement on the face is not in relation to anything else on the face. So they can actually turn up elsewhere, as we see in his very late work. They don't even have to turn up in the same direction that you would commonly expect. The nose here has gotten much larger. He sees it as very prominent, and you'll see it's simplified once again, primarily seen in profile, because of course that's the most recognizable form. Whereas over here, it's actually done from below, and you're looking at the nostrils. The mouth, again, has no relation to the rest of the face other than it sits fairly low. And we see the same thing over here, where the mouth has actually been turned. The line of the jaw is most interesting from the side. So he kind of distorts it and moves it over. Whereas here he's focusing on the line of the cheek and the jaw is completely irrelevant. Whereas typically you would have that line of the cheek and line of the jaw depicted on both sides. So what they're doing is they're taking these individual characteristics, the characteristics that are most identifiable to whatever the form is, and they're moving them around as necessary to give us a better impression of what we're looking at. This is.
I think that is a pretty good description. This is another one that talks about Cubism as well. It simplifies it rather. And I think that even though I think that that is kind of a simple perspective on Cubism. It's a lot more that does talk about a major part of Cubism, where the artist is trying to share with you their own experience with whatever the subject matter is, and so the individual elements it doesn't seem to matter as much how they relate to each other in an easily understandable way, as long as you see their experience of those elements. And so I think that is a pretty good description of Cubism as well. And it is interesting to me as well. We were, like Van, a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about orthogons and just the rectangles, the aesthetic rectangles that we use to kind of construct our understanding of pictures. And then there's a lot of these kinds of rules that we have to help us balance things out. I think that there's something called pareidolia, which is a word that is used to describe an observed tendency for human beings to try to find order in apparent chaos. Pareidolia is the tool that we use when we are finding faces in clouds, for example. But what that guy said at the very beginning of the video, I think, is really integral to the entire discussion, understanding, and appreciation of Cubism, which is that it is essentially intentional expression. It's intentional observation and sharing of what is seen by the artist. It's I say Derrida would later talk about it as deconstructionism, but we're essentially almost dissecting the totality of something and sharing the individual experiences that we have with that thing to try to give a person a better, more nuanced and more personal view of whatever that thing is. So I think that those different explanations all come together pretty well. What do you guys think?
Andrew, do you think that was really interesting? Because when he was saying, most of the time when we move forward on any type of art, whether it's sculpture or whether it's painting, we attempt for symmetry. And it feels like what Picasso was doing with Cubism, and what this narrator said was that he only focused on one eye at a time and not in any relation to the other eye. And it feels like it's almost in defiance of symmetry. It's kind of an interesting, I don't know. I thought that was really interesting that he moved away from representational options that we've done in the past and then moved into a different dynamic of looking at their own perceptions of reality, potentially.
Well, looking at expressionism, people were exploring new ways of exaggerating features and dabbling with color and all this experimenting with color and all this kind of stuff, but they were still pretty centered onto this idea that there was there was some sort of expressed symmetry. Like even in the terrifying distortions of the human face that were done with the screen. What's his face? Who's the artist? Edvard Munch. He's still dealing with these ideas of symmetry as they relate to our shared symbology and understanding of the human form. And I think that is really a valuable observation that the narrator made, that there was, it seems to be more movement towards informal, inexact balance, where there's still the balance, there's still the aesthetics there, but he's kind of pushing people's acceptance and complacence regarding the assumption of symmetry. I think that's a really good observation. I love that, because that feels really consistent too.
I think so. Again, the tying the masks back, and his early work as it starts to sort of unravel into Cubism, because Picasso was a prodigy who was an academic painter when he was pretty young. Anyway, when he did the portrait of Gertrude Stein.
Yeah.
I read somewhere that he really, really had a difficult time trying to represent her essence, and I'm gonna probably slaughter it, but when he presented the portrait to her, she said, "This doesn't look like me," And he says, "Oh, but you will look like this someday." So
I think that's really fascinating because what you just shared ties in with all these things coming together, I think. It's what the artist isn't just portraying a shared visual language, they are also sharing what they very intensely personal observation of the subject matter. Yeah, I think that's really cool. I had just a couple of videos. I don't that are introducing just Pablo Picasso and Braque. In my mind, there's like three major cubists. These are the three people that, even though they weren't all doing the exact same thing at the beginning, Picasso and Braque did stop signing their paintings because they told their gallery representatives that they were losing track of which part of which work was whose. Because they were both working on the same ideas and sharing with each other all the time. But the third person that I think is integral to our contemporary understanding of Cubism looking back is Marcel Duchamp. And he did some really amazing things. I don't think I'm going to show these videos. I do want you guys to watch them on your own. But looking at this, we look at Picasso sharing. This is looks like a cityscape, and the reason why I say that is the shapes that he's used in this painting are indicative of shapes that you see in buildings and roads. You have arches in doorways. You have angles like stairs. You have other arches leading into areas and buildings, as well as different elements that we see on the exterior of buildings. And with the different shading, this isn't arbitrary. It is sharing the passage of time on these different elements throughout the day. This is where the shadow might have been, not an exact representation of the shadow, but implying the idea that this is a shadow at a specific time of day. This is the shadow on another architectural element at another specific time of day. So we're seeing a cityscape as time passes through it. And we can see the stairs right there, in that little area. I think that's absolutely fascinating. And both Picasso and Braque were experimenting with collage because they wanted to also move away from the very strict expectations that people had about the materials that real artists could use. And I think this ties in with what you were saying, Joey, as well as you, Van, when you were talking about the assumption of symmetry. And when Joey was talking about expressing Gertrude Stein's relationship with shared visual vocabulary, and Picasso was telling her, well, this is a painting that has been done through time, not just a static moment kind of thing. And I think we can really see that in this cityscape image up here by Picasso. And Braque is also exploring, people are expecting to see shared imagery. They're expecting to see single focus and symmetry. Braque started experimenting with everything from picking up dirt and little rocks to mix with his paint, to sandpaper from a workman, material that he would find, cutouts, music, all sorts of stuff. Picasso liked to experiment also with different kind of cellulose media, like cardboard, different kinds of cardboard too, wrapping paper, different materials like that, using them to express visual texture in the different elements that they were exploring. And then Marcel Duchamp, let's see, I'm going to start playing this and then I'm going to mute it. If we look at Marcel Duchamp's famous nude descending a staircase, a lot of people despise this. A lot of art critics despise this because they said nudes were like the apex subject for a serious artist. And they should always be doing important things, which I think is kind of hilarious. That usually that amounts to lounging in a bed somewhere or lounging outside or lounging. But because the nude in Duchamp's painting is simply walking downstairs, a lot of people dismissed it and were offended because nude should be doing something so much more important. I think that is one of the dumbest arguments I've ever heard, which I can't say if any of those guys are still alive. But it is, I'm sorry this is taking such a long time to load. Let's see if I can, I'm going to see if I can find a more recent image or another image of nude descending a staircase. Let's see. I'm sorry, I'm caught a little bit unprepared with that because I expected that video, just like all the other videos we've looked at, would load really, really fast.
Hey, so I'm
Okay, here we go.
Oh, sorry, you got it ready.
Okay, I've just found it. Let's see. Now, Joey, you know who Edward Maybridge is?
Yeah.
Yeah, he was doing all sorts of work at about this time as well, really exploring the mechanics of movement, in organic, with organic creatures moving. Particularly famous are his people walking and running, the famous bet about the horse, all those kinds of things.
Yeah,
And this is really the birth of what's happening.
If a horse's feet touch the ground at the same time.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And his photography work, he set up. For those who aren't familiar, he set up multiple cameras and timed them to go off in rapid succession and take instant shots as a subject was moving. And sometimes this would be animals. Most often it would be people. He was really engaged with understanding how people's bodies impacted the environment around them as they engage with them through the process of activity. And it really helped a lot of people who became cinematographers and directors in the birth of the movie industry, so that they could understand how to get shots and imagery that would emphasize story and engage people in the drama, and because of the work that Edward Maybridge did. And so, think about that. If you can imagine dozens of photos as somebody is walking somewhere, and then processing them all on glass plates so they're semi-transparent, and then stacking them all up, that's when we start seeing something very similar to what Marcel Duchamp did with nude descending a staircase. And he's also exploring those ideas, moving away from the assumptions of symmetry and the pleasing malleability and softness of the human form, by sharing essentially just the highlights and reflections of light off the person's body as they're moving and engaging through this shape that they're descending. I thought talking about this and being angry because the nude is doing something so prosaic and boring is one of the weakest arguments against it that I can think of. I don't understand how lounging on a chase or laying down in a field or standing at the edge of a beach is any more vitally important to the history of humanity and the universe than somebody walking downstairs. I don't get that. But those three people, each approaching it from slightly different, their own unique perspectives, developed this methodology of Cubism which really defines how we appreciate and understand it today. Marcel Duchamp went on to do other stuff. He was a pioneer in so many other fields, directly addressing how human beings relate with art itself and the process of creation. And both Pablo Picasso and Braque, they both put their own tweaks on Cubism, but I think those three guys together really are the ones that defined it for the rest of the world. And this is also an art movement where we see a really concentrated engagement in many respects with the different artists that were exploring this movement. Like Expressionism almost seemed to spontaneously combust after it reached, the ideas reached critical mass, because there wasn't a lot of communication. And then after Cubism, when we go into Dada, people they were actually actively coordinating what they were doing. And at the very beginning, as these new ideas were spreading, they started to talk with each other. Picasso and Braque even started publishing what we would call like fanzines or newsletters, email newsletters today, so that people could see what they were doing and what they were thinking about as they were developing these images. And so here's a couple other Picassos, a couple other Cubists, and I think that we can see a lot of significant similarity among the different things that they were doing. Even though they came from different areas in Europe and the world, this feels to me a bit tighter knit cognitively as an art movement than Expressionism that we looked at last week. And I want you to, we don't need to watch the videos, but I do want to share, at least an image or two from each of these artists. This is Juan Gris, and you can see that he is really using the idea of collage that Picasso and Braque had been developing. He's using it not just to separate images and share his different faceted viewpoints, but he's also using it as alternative substrate for the drawing and painting. Like here's some chalk work on some black paper. Here's some graphite work on essentially wrapping paper. And here's some printed material, some and other things that he's doing that I think are really fascinating. And I'm just gonna, and so I also have a video here. It's just a couple minutes long, and it shows some of the paintings and other things that he did. This still life with grapes, and and you can see the silhouettes of the grapes right here. I think it's absolutely fascinating that Picasso and Braque also encountered imagery of rock art and from Africa, and I wonder if they were thinking about cave art and different things like that. And the only reason I wonder about that is that Juan Gris, the way he developed these grape shapes, is that they're silhouettes that are developed by using grape shapes as the mask, as he's spattering or giving a spattering texture around it, just like the ancient cave paintings around the world when people would spit pigment over their hands against the rock. And I think that's really fascinating. Yeah.
I was thinking that a lot of the images, especially the cityscape that you're showing us, it's really reminiscent of like, Lascaux cave art, or, petroglyphs or pictographs, which is a really stripped down and simplified visual language.
Right.
But a lot of times it gets discounted. Like people are always like, oh, I think it was just some guy, doodling on a wall, not taking into account how much skill and effort it would have taken to make it. Like try making that. That would be difficult. But I think the other piece of it, relating back to how it roots us, these languages root us into reality. The language, the visual language, probably meant something to those cultures. And I think about it, as, it's probably a terrible comparison, but you and I could have a complete conversation right now using emojis.
Oh yeah.
Because they're, you can communicate so many ideas through a really simple, or, like stop signs, man, there's a lot of stuff communicated through traffic signs, traffic signals, the way they move vehicles, and they're so simple. So there's really a great complexity to what it's doing, but the visual language is so stripped down and sparse that it's, a lot of people might discount it as easy, but
I think that those are excellent observations. There's a woman named Dr. Genevieve von Penziger, and she has gone through as many cave systems as she can in Europe that had art in them, documented as much as possible, and actually found almost an alphabet. It's a collection of 32 specific symbols that seem to be used over a course of about 25,000 years from our ancestors all around Europe. And
she's an amateur too, right? She was an amateur. I think she's an amateur, right? She's not.
She now has a doctorate in, I believe it's anthropology, but they just started exploring it. Her husband was her photographer, and these caves are incredibly complicated to get to.
Yes.
And there's a Danish statistician that discovered, because of the way that the fingers are on those handprints, then statistically, about 67% of those handprints in the cave paintings were done by women. And and those two ideas completely change the assumed simplicity of that artwork, which it's incredible. It's almost impossible to get to do, and it's 2/3 of them are probably done by women. And we're thinking, you look at some of these depictions of the photoreal running bison, for example, where the movement through time comes because their legs are in multiple places. The hunters knew the anatomy, they weren't going to mess that up. And so they're actually showing the process of running, just like Edward Maybridge overlaying his glass prints on each other. I think that's absolutely fascinating.
And then painting it from memory.
Yeah.
In the dark cave by torchlight.
Yeah, you're not going to be able to get one of those animals in there to stand still for you. That's for sure.
Yes, very cool.
Well, and this guy is, his name is Fernand Leger. This is work that he did at the University of Central Venezuela. And this, I think, is really kind of interesting. It was one of the things that I found of his that I thought was really fascinating. I think he's moving away. This is his much more recent work. This is older, but it still has a lot of those flavors of Cubism, where he's concentrating on individual forms and shapes and how he feels about them, rather than demonstrating a facility with shared language, which I think is really cool. But if we look at some earlier work by Albert Glazes, again, I'm really sorry if anybody is offended by how I mispronounce their names. This returns us back to that feeling that we got seeing the stuff like the Picasso cityscape, doesn't it? Where we can really see different aspects of, like, here is the profile on the right-hand side. This is more frontal view of the same individual. This is when they had their hand up on the edge of the couch. This is when they had their arm down to their side. This, and it's the same arm. This is where they had their hand on they had their arm with their elbow on whatever they were sitting on. And this is when they moved a little while later and had their arm draping off the side. And so we can see these passages and moments in time. Looking out here, the same kind of thing. This is just a short sequence of one facet of the building that he sees through the window. At a certain time of day, this is where the light's hitting it. At a different time of day, this is another facet of a building right next to it, or maybe even the same building, how the light has changed on it, so it seems a little bit brighter. This is stairs from another aspect of another building. They're not going to be all in the same proportion. They're not going to be all in the same perspective either. These stairs here, this may be a carpet. These may be stairs in another part of the room that he's wanting to put there because it's integral to his sharing of the whole scene, the whole room. He's not giving us a snapshot of a person laying down in a hammock. He is giving us pretty much the whole day's worth of activity in one image. And I think that that's really exciting. Go to another one. Not all of these made it to this presentation today. So, and I think we're going to run out of time. But I think you're getting the sense that these guys are working. These men and women that are Cubists are working with very common ways of sharing how they experience reality. And what's exceptional to me is they're also showing you, they're not just demonstrating a window of how they view the world, they're also creating specifically a reality that fits and blends into their own unique perspective, which I think is absolutely fascinating. This is Robert Delaney's window with orange curtains. Well, yeah, the curtains we can see pretty obviously, but he's looking through, what is this structure here? Anybody want to guess? I'll give you a hint. He painted it in France.
Is it the Empire State Building of France?
That's exactly right. It is the Eiffel Tower.
The Eiffel State Building.
The Eiffel State Building. And what's so cool about this is, again, you see this one structure, we can recognize what it is, but we also see in this one structure, he's painted it from specifically 3 different points of time during the day. And I think that that's absolutely astounding. Oh, Brittany just joined us. I'm sorry, Brittany, were you trying to get in earlier and I blocked you?
Nope.
Okay, I probably did it I probably blocked somebody else, and whoever they are, when they watch this, I am really, really sorry. When I closed the window, I thought it was somebody trying to message me, and it was really irritating. So I'm sorry for whoever did I blocked. But we have one point of time where the sunlight brightened up 2/3 of this space, another point of time when this was in shadow, dark shadow, and another point of time where the sunlight is coming almost from behind us to brighten up this whole area too. So we're seeing in one shot multiple snapshots of time. And I don't know, I just think that is super cool. I'm glad that these guys were able to do this, and it's exciting to me that they did such a beautiful job in sharing this with us. Now, Sonia was the wife of Robert Delaney, and what she did, I think, is absolutely amazing as well. Oh, I'm sorry, I did not share the right image. So we're going to go back. There we go. This is her image, and I will find the right link for it. Let's see. Okay, here we go. This image is called Electrical Prisms, and this is done at the same time. All of her friends, fellow professional artists, and Sonia was a professional artist. She's been overshadowed in history, but she produced just like everybody else. She was, a pro. What I like about her work, though, is that she's sharing more about, instead of grounding this specifically in a shared landscape, she's sharing with you perspectives and reflections themselves instead of linking them to a solid object. And I think that that's absolutely fascinating, because this feels structurally very Cubist, doesn't it? However, it doesn't have that physical grounding like those other images we looked at did. And she did other stuff that was grounded in the physical shared world. But that's one of the reasons why I love this painting so much, is that it seems to me that she's showing you how she thought about colors and prisms and ideas throughout the day. And she is centering it on a common theme of these starlight reflections of light. And I think it's a very cool way of looking at stuff.
Yeah, ever since you you referenced Maybridge, I can see these in motion. It's almost like, you know, the last one with the Eiffel Tower. It's it's like looking at a slow time lapse. Really beautiful. And then I have a question for you. Have you ever tried making a cubist piece of stained glass?
One constraint that I have is I have to make stuff for people who pay for it. But that being said, I have done some stuff where I experimented with that and played with it. And I kind of blended my cubism with Marc Chagall, because I love Marc Chagall's work. He was more of a surrealist. And it's really a challenge sharing an entire day's worth of experience or longer in a single image where I want to kind of digest bites of the whole experience. And I don't know, it's kind of hard to describe, but it can be really frustrating as well as being incredibly liberating to do that. The Russian, the Russian expressionist photographers did a lot of really fascinating stuff, kind of moving surrealism back into a cubist expression. Have you done anything like that with your photography?
No, my photography is more centered around people and moments. You know, I don't get too abstract. But yeah, the Russians were doing some pretty wild stuff.
Well, it's fascinating because they were also making collages that they were actually creating during the processing of images, as opposed to processing the images, cutting them out and putting them together. So they were doing some really fascinating experimental work with just developing the overall imagery. And I'm trying to find an image by Gene Metzinger as well that we can look at. So give me just a second right here. Okay, here we go. Here's some nice stuff. And I think on this, we can also see some of what we're talking about. Van, have you had experience in your clay work and stuff like that, creating like cubist imagery?
I haven't moved into cubism as much, but for this next assignment, I've always been fascinated with the sorrow head that identifies all of the facial features in distinct shapes. And so I'm going to try that one for this one coming up, and I'm excited about it. It always has reminded me of a type of sculpture in Cubism. So, and it's really interesting.
That's really pretty interesting. And when I was doing work about 20, 25 years ago, I had a grant from BYU to study indigenous art in 5 different communities of North America. One of them was the Tlingit and Kwakiutl Northwest Indian art, or Northwest Indigenous art. And Franz Boas was an anthropologist that did a lot of work collating imagery and symbolism from them. And one of the things I noticed is that they shared a lot with the Cubists, 1,000 years later, because they were trying to share, like when they would depict an osprey, it wasn't just a bird in flight, it was a bird at rest and in flight at the same time. It was imagery where the face is profile and frontal at the same time. They would still explore ideas of symmetry, but the eyes weren't just eyes, they were also expressive and moving all at the same time. And it was really fascinating seeing that kind of artwork. So yeah, I did build windows around that. So if you can find my Arrow to the Sun series online, that does have quite a bit of windows in it that have a lot of that cubist kind of stuff going on. But I didn't think of it right away because in my mind I was honoring what the Kwakiutl and Tlingit were doing. So, which I have to say, as an art professional, so that everybody is amazed by how smart I am. You know, that was the whole point of that brief demonstration. But this image, this is by Jean Metzinger. And I think that this is fascinating too, because you can see very clearly different perspectives. Like, for example, this water pitcher, you know, or this clear carafe, here it is with it's standing still. He's sitting down. He sees the water at a certain level. A little while later, as the water level has dropped, he's standing up and you see the top surface of the water. These pears, same kind of thing. He's moved around these pears and shown you them from a couple different perspectives. This passage right around the tomato, you have a painting, you know, he started painting it at one point of the day, and then a few hours later, he's showing the shadow where the shadows have shifted. Same kind of thing, the side view from him sitting down and then also standing up and approaching it. It's exciting to me because as he's painting this still life, he's walking around it, and he's walking around it throughout the day, and you can see all of that. You're engaged, you're engaging with him in that passage of time, which is fantastic. And then, of course, my hero, Marcel Duchamp. We've talked about his nude descending a staircase. What I love about him is for the rest of his life after this, he was constantly combating from the perspective of overall education, I think, and approaching a shared understanding more than just being a jerk about it. But he was constantly dealing with this idea of how people understood and approached art. And even though a lot of people don't like trying to interact with the stuff that he did, his intent was to create an environment so none of us were crippled by our ignorance, that we could actually appreciate what was going on, that we were, he was trying to help us to become empowered by granting permission for people to create art and to label different things as art, and which I think is just amazing. Like, one of the exercises I like doing is talking about ready-mades from him, which is kind of a Cubist approach to phenomenology through understanding the symbol of a singular object, where by decontextualizing it and presenting it in a completely different perspective and creating a narrative for it, you are helping somebody else understand the multiple views you have of a single object. Like his famous one was the fountain, which is a men's urinal set on its side. When we talk about a fountain, when we talk about a men's urinal, we're thinking of waste disposal, of course, obviously, but we're also thinking about some of the awkward sociality that exists within a restroom. You can't make eye contact with anybody. You have to pretend you don't see or recognize anybody else, and you certainly can't let on that you smell anything. And then there's also the idea that something as simple as a shared restroom, a public restroom, enables industry and society by creating or by sustaining the urban place, the urban environment. Then you also have the idea of all the jobs, all the thinking that went into the planning, sometimes really bad planning, that went into the placement of the different elements necessary to the urban society, or to the cityscape. And so with that one object, he's asking us to think in a very Cubist way about all of his perspectives as well, just by inviting you to participate in creating new context. And so that's one of the reasons why I think Marcel Duchamp is the very fairy godfather, definitely, of contemporary art, if not modern art. I think he's amazing. Now, this is a Russian woman. Her name is Natalia Goncharova, and she was also a Cubist, doing the very similar kinds of things to these other things that we were seeing. And what is so fascinating and amazing to me about her is when everybody else feels very intellectual and contemplative, she seems to be a lot more happy. You know, which I think is specifically the Russians that I have met that really pride themselves in being Russian find that they're rather dismissive of the way that we hold War and Peace on a pedestal, because they say it's way too happy. You know? And I think it's ironic that Natalia Goncharova does these things that really share her enjoyment with life. And I think that that's absolutely fascinating. Now here we're dealing with an aesthetic. She's addressing the ideas of assumed symmetry, like Van was talking about, but she's also sharing with us not just a passage through time, but also a personal passage of time for the subject that she is painting. Where it looks like to me, this woman is wearing several different dresses. And we see portions of the different dresses as she moves through a day. You know, like the lines of this fabric do not match the lines of this fabric. They're not even the same structure. And the colors are different. This is a passage through a day where we have, this is towards the evening, and this is brighter, you know, maybe even an afternoon or bright morning. The individual is, we do have aspects like the narrator was talking about with Picasso, where this part of the face seems to be almost more of a three-quarter profile, and while this side seems to be fully frontal. And overall, the color choice, it's a lot less drab than many of her French and Spanish counterparts that were also painting at the same time. And that seems to be true for a lot of her work. And I think that's fascinating. Both Sonia and Natalia were approaching Cubism using the same kind of parameters that their male counterparts were, but these two women seem to infect their work with a little bit more liveliness, a little bit more hopefulness, maybe, but definitely a little bit more positive energy. I just think that that's fascinating. That's one of the reasons why I included them, just because I was excited to see their work too. So I'll get those images on up onto the module as soon as we're done here, so that you guys will be able to see that in the module as well. And each of these artists that I mentioned, there is a 2 to 5 minute video just about their work and how people think about it. One of them, I think, even has a reenactment of one of the artists as they were creating some work. But there's some really kind of fun stuff to go on. So what do you guys think about Cubism? Coming into this, did it seem kind of daunting? And what do you think now? Or has your perspective changed at all?
I really like the idea that we discussed regarding the multiple moments in time in one painting. I think that's something that I haven't taken into consideration with Cubism before, but I love the idea of identifying not only one moment, but that you can illustrate multiple moments in a day or a specific timeline in one two-dimensional object. It's really neat.
Well, and I love that the incredible empowerment that the artist took just to be willing to be brave enough to explore that.
Yeah, there's a documentary. It's failing me right now, but there was a guy who did a documentary on Picasso, and he set up a glass easel where he could film him painting. He said that so the documentarian devised that to be able to understand Picasso's process, and then Picasso told him, I'm glad you're doing this because I hope it'll help me understand it. Because he didn't have a he didn't under he spent his whole life trying to figure out where it came from, and he he has this reputation of being a playboy and socialite, but he was also, this documentarian just said that he was just a massive workaholic. He was never done working.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it's a whole fascinating thing.
A lot of these artists, they have so much going on in their head and all their communication is spewed onto the canvas. It's really difficult for them to slow down enough to give any sort of precision to their language so they can articulate what they're doing. And it's, they're rushing on a freight train in their mind. And I can imagine how difficult it would be to come down and try to draw in the dirt as the train is going by so that other people can read what they're thinking, because all their intent, they're putting all that information into the visual language that they share. Yeah, Picasso also, he produced a massive body of work. Towards the end of his life, he lamented his production. He said, I've become nothing more than a public clown capering to the whims of the masses, which I thought was really sad, because he's given so much more to our expanding understanding of reality than he could have possibly imagined, I think. He and his contemporaries, the people that worked with him, that talked with him, they were also exploring the same kinds of ideas. I think that's fascinating. Well, I think that this is a pretty good discussion that we've had today. I hope that when you go back and look at Cubism after our talk, the things that we talked about, you're not going to be able to unsee. I think once you see the African mask, once you see multiple perspectives, and once you see multiple passages of time and awareness of phenomenology and our unique creative relationship with ongoing production of reality, I don't think you can unsee that. And it's, for me as a viewer, it's empowering, because not only have they given permission for me to create meaning in the work that they've done, they also kind of demand it. They're doing something that's challenging on purpose, so we are forced to engage with it, think critically, think with intention, and then develop a meaning as well alongside them. And I think that's what the best art does, among other things. I think it's a collaboration, always a collaboration between the creator and the viewer, so that we can become co-creators for the new meaning. I think that's absolutely fascinating. Well, folks, any last observations before we wind it up until next week? All right. Now, Joey, you mentioned that you had a little bit of trouble accessing last week's recording.
That was all my fault. I found it.
Okay. Yeah. All right.
I'm just
okay,
yeah, you had it in the right spot.
Okay. All right. Great. Because I have done the most fantastic lectures that I ever thought humanly possible in the history of the world, just to find out that it didn't record any of it. And so it would not surprise me at all if I screwed it up. But other people haven't whined about it, which of course does not mean they can't access it. It may just mean that they're kind of keeping their heads down because they don't want to have to do more homework. But who knows? All right. Well, I hope you guys have an absolutely wonderful weekend. Like I said, as soon as I get close the call, I will get on and put the last couple of images on that last section of the module. But please do watch each of those videos, because I think it's a lot better than to just see static paintings, to kind of hear what other people have to say about the development and continuation of the person's artwork. I think that that's all. Even if we may not agree with it, that's fine. It's absolutely wonderful, though, to have multiple perspectives, I think. And I think that is one of the real gifts that Cubism still continues to give us, that permission and empowerment to honestly hold and engage with equally valid multiple perspectives. I think it's amazing. All right, folks, you have a good weekend and do your best not to get arrested.